The first thing Kael Duren noticed about the Vethkai ship was that it smelled like copper and old rain. He was already inside by the time that registered, which told him everything about how good they were at what they did. No airlock hiss, no transition pressure, just a corridor that appeared around him like a thought he hadn't decided to have. The Vethkai didn't build doors the way humans built doors. They built thresholds, membranes that read your biology and either absorbed you or didn't. Kael's had spent 4 months learning to smell like something the membrane would accept. 4 months of enzyme baths and dietary suppressants, and a biochemical signature patch glued to the inside of his left forearm that itched constantly and would kill him if he removed it incorrectly. He adjusted the collar of his borrowed Vethkai formal wrap and kept walking. The gala was held in what the Vethkai called a floating senate, a zero-gravity reception space rotating slowly enough that the centrifugal effect mimicked about 0.6 standard G, enough to keep your drink in your glass, not enough to keep your stomach where you expected it. Kael had practiced. He moved through the crowd of elongated bodies and bioluminescent ceremonial markings without touching anyone, which was the only etiquette rule that mattered. The Vethkai did not touch casually. To touch was to signal intent. Every diplomat, trade speaker, and intelligence gatherer from 7 systems knew that rule. The ones who forgot it usually ended the evening face down in a decompression chamber. He found the terminal in the 3rd antechamber, behind a lattice of living coral glass that the Vethkai grew for decoration, and humans had started calling Razorbloom because of what happened if you brushed against it in low light. Kael went through on his knees, moving slow, and when he came out the other side, he was bleeding from 2 places on his right hand and hadn't made a sound. The terminal looked nothing like a terminal. It looked like a lamp, a curved pedestal of something that was either ceramic or bone. Kael still wasn't sure, with a faint warm glow pulsing up through it at irregular intervals. He'd been told by the woman who briefed him, a directorate analyst named Prescott, who communicated exclusively through written notes and never made eye contact, that the pulse interval was the Vethkai equivalent of a loading screen. When it went steady, the system was idle. When it stuttered, someone was actively using it. It was stuttering now. He waited, the pulse steadied. He placed the transfer node against the base and held it there for exactly 11 seconds, and then pulled it away and tucked it back into the hollow of his left boot and stood up and walked back through the Razorbloom without flinching and rejoined the party. The data on that node would tell the Directorate's interspecies arbitration team whether the Vethkai Meridian Compact had falsified their resource declaration in the Kepler corridor talks. Falsified it badly enough that 3 human colony systems would receive insufficient food supplement shipments this winter. Badly enough that children would die. Kael didn't think about that part. He'd learned not to. He accepted a glass of something fluorescent from a passing service drone and did not drink it, and watched the Vethkai Grand Arbiter hold court across the room. The Arbiter was tall even for his species, nearly 3 meters, and his bioluminescence was gold, which Kael had been told signified either great status or great grief, and the analysts disagreed on which. He moved through his guests the way a current moves through water, not pushing, just rearranging everything around him. Then the Arbiter turned, and his gaze, 8-chambered, copper-ringed, ancient in a way that made Kael's chest tighten, found Kael across the room. Kael smiled and raised his glass. The Arbiter looked away. Kael set down the glass and walked to the nearest exit at exactly the pace of a man who had not just stolen the most classified document in Vethkai diplomatic history. He made it off the ship. He did not make it home. The arrest came 6 hours later in his Directorate-assigned quarters on Relay Station Andra, which meant the leak was internal, which meant someone had already decided Kael was going to take the fall for something he hadn't done yet. The charge was assassination. The Vethkai trade delegation's secondary speaker, a minor functionary named Sev Oth, who had been alive and complaining about the climate control in his quarters when Kael left the ship, had been found dead in the floating Senate's lower spoke, killed with a human pattern wound, blunt trauma to the cranial ridge, precise, efficient, the kind of strike a human combative trainer would recognize immediately. The Directorate security team came in with pulse suppressors, and Kael considered fighting them and then didn't, because fighting them would mean he couldn't find out who had set him up and why. And he needed to know that, more than he needed to be free. He was wrong about that. He found that out very quickly. The detention cell they put him in was Vethkai designed. Their idea of imprisonment was sensory rather than physical. No bars, no locks, just walls that sang at a frequency that made human equilibrium fail. Kael sat on the floor and let his inner ear recalibrate and thought about what he knew. What he knew was this. Sev Oth had been the one Vethkai functionary actively pushing back against the falsified resource declaration. The one who had been quietly signaling the directorate through tertiary channels that something was wrong. The one, in other words, who was supposed to help Kael's theft matter. Who was supposed to testify. He was dead. Kael had been framed. The node was gone. Security had taken everything, which meant someone inside the directorate had wanted the falsified data buried, had wanted Eighth silenced, and had chosen to use Kael as the instrument of his own destruction. The architecture of it was almost elegant. Kael had broken into the Vethkai ship. He had the motive to silence a witness. He had the skills to do it cleanly. He didn't officially exist, which meant no one would fight very hard for him. He closed his eyes and listened to the walls sing and thought, "Then I'll fight for myself." He went through the ventilation system. This was not a sophisticated plan. He was the first to admit that. But the Vethkai, for all their brilliance in sensory architecture and biochemical engineering and diplomatic manipulation that spanned centuries, had never quite internalized the human relationship to small enclosed spaces. They were claustrophobic by biology. Their chest cavities required more room to expand than a human's. Their bioluminescent organs needed airflow, or they dimmed and caused the Vethkai genuine physical distress. The ventilation shafts on Relay Station Andra were sized for Vethkai comfort. They were huge. Kael crawled through them for 90 minutes and emerged in the civilian transit quarter, smelling like recycled atmosphere and tasting blood from where he'd bitten his cheek to stay focused during the worst of the equilibrium effects. He needed two things. He needed someone who had no reason to help the people trying to bury him, and he needed to understand why a directorate analyst would be willing to let 3 colony systems starve in order to hide a data falsification that their own organization had sent Kael to expose. The answer to the second question would give him the answer to the first. If you followed the resource data, if you figured out who benefited from those 3 systems not receiving their shipments, you'd know who wanted the information dead. And you'd know who inside the directorate they owned. He found a public comm terminal in a transit food kiosk run by a Herrick couple who sold something that approximated dumplings and asked no questions of anyone. He bought 2 and ate them standing up and thought about Prescott, the analyst who had briefed him, the notes instead of words, the avoidance of eye contact. He'd thought that was a personality quirk. Now he thought it was guilt. Her name wasn't Prescott. He learned that later. Her real name was Tamara Osei, and she had been embedded in Directorate Intelligence for 11 years, and she was the one who had put Kael's mission together, which meant she was either the betrayer or the person closest to the betrayer, and those 2 things were not always different. He found her in a secondary data archive on Andra's research ring, which was either where she worked or where she'd run to, and he was going in without a weapon and without a plan beyond the immediate moment, which was how he'd been trained and how he worked best. She was at a terminal when he came through the maintenance access panel, and she spun around and he put 2 fingers to his lips. "They're going to kill you," he said. "After me." She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were shaking, but her face had gone very still, the way faces go still when someone has already accepted the thing they were most afraid of. "I know," she said. "Then tell me who." "If I tell you, they'll Tamara." He used her real name and watched her blink. "They already did." She looked at him, and then she turned back to the terminal and started pulling files. The shape of it was this. The Vethkai Meridian Compact was not a single faction. It had never been. It was a coalition of bloodlines whose interests converged on trade but diverged violently on everything else. The falsified resource data wasn't about starving 3 human colony systems. That was a side effect, an acceptable loss in a calculation that had nothing to do with humans at all. The falsification existed to redirect compact shipping lanes away from the Kepler corridor and toward a system the compact's minority faction, the bloodline the Grand Arbiter came from, had been quietly terraforming for a decade. Pull the trade routes, starve the corridor of traffic, make it worthless, absorb it quietly when no one was watching. And the person inside the directorate who had helped design it, who had shaped the intelligence mission, so that a directorate operative would be holding a stolen data node when a Vethkai witness died. That was a man named Capella. Directorate Deputy Director, Interspecies Affairs. Kael had met him once. He'd been making coffee, and he'd had no stir stick, and he'd swirled the sugar with his finger instead. And he'd smiled at Kael across the break room in a way that was perfectly friendly and revealed nothing. That smile. That was the thing Kael kept coming back to, the complete absence of tells. He'd looked at Kael, like Kael was a tool that had been picked up and would shortly be put back down. He was right, more or less. He just had the direction wrong. Getting off Relay Station Andra required a distraction. The distraction Kael created was not subtle, but it was fast. He rerouted the station's atmospheric mixing sequence on the research ring's lower 3 decks to produce a concentration of a compound that was harmless to humans, but caused Vethkai bioluminescence to flicker. Just flicker, no injury, no real harm. But in a space where a third of the population was Vethkai and flickering was biologically distressing, it produced exactly the kind of general alarm and confusion and personnel redeployment that allowed 2 humans to walk quickly to a secondary docking spoke and board a transit shuttle that Tamara had booked under a name that no longer existed. She had been planning an exit. That confirmed she'd known the betrayal was coming and hadn't stopped it. He didn't ask her about that until they were in transit. When he did, she looked at the viewport for a while. "They had my daughter," she said. "She's on Kepler 7. One of the 3 systems." He didn't say anything. "The falsification." She stopped. Started again. "If the resource shortfall goes through, Kepler 7 is bad but survivable. If I'd tried to stop Capella directly, if I'd blown it open, the retribution would have been." She stopped again. "You were protecting her. I was choosing." She turned from the viewport and looked at him, and her eyes were very steady. I've been choosing her over everyone else for 11 years. I'm not going to pretend that was noble, but I'm also not going to pretend I'd do it differently." Kael thought about that, about the architecture of impossible choices, about the way people became instruments of harm not because they were monstrous, but because they were trying to protect something specific and human and small. "The daughter," he said. "What's her name?" "Mara." "Okay." He looked at the viewport. "Let's make sure Mara eats this winter." They needed proof that would survive the source. Tamara had files, but files could be discredited. She was compromised, he was fugitive, and Capella had 11 years of institutional goodwill and a reputation for being the most effective interspecies mediator the Directorate had ever produced. It wouldn't be enough to expose him. It had to come from somewhere he couldn't reach. The data node that security had confiscated when they arrested Kael, the one with the actual Vethkai falsification evidence, was in a Directorate evidence vault on Andra, which he'd just left. That was one problem. The other problem was that Sev-Oth was dead, and Oth had been the Vethkai witness, the inside voice, the one who could have corroborated everything. That door was closed. Unless it wasn't. Kael spent 3 hours in transit going through everything Tamara had pulled from the archive, 8th tertiary channel communications, his signaling pattern, the specific concerns he'd raised, the timeline, and then he found it. Ath had not been working alone. There was a second voice in those channels, a Vethkai bloodline name he didn't recognize, communicating through an additional layer of encryption that Tamara's excess had only partially decrypted. Someone else inside the compact who had known about the falsification and been trying to stop it. Someone who was not dead. "Can you finish the decryption?" he asked. She was already working. The name that came out of the encryption was one he knew after all. Not a minor functionary, not an analyst or a trade speaker, the Grand Arbiter's daughter. Her name was Velsay Orath, and she was, according to Tamara's background files, assembled with the thoroughness of someone who had been running intelligence operations for a decade, the Arbiter's political heir, his most trusted advisor, and the one member of the ruling bloodline who had consistently opposed the resource falsification from inside compact deliberations. Her opposition had been overruled. She'd been marginalized. She had then started quietly feeding concerns to Sev-Oth, knowing he had Directorate contacts, knowing the channel existed. She didn't know Sev-Oth was dead yet. She didn't know the channel had been compromised. And she didn't know that the human operative she'd been trying to help was currently a fugitive wanted for Ath's murder. Kael composed his message very carefully. He had one shot at this. If she decided he was the murderer, if she decided the channel was hot, she would disappear into the labyrinthine bloodline politics of the compact, and no one outside the Vethkai would ever reach her again. He told her the truth. All of it, including the parts that reflected badly on him. He told her about the node, the gala, the frame-up, He told her about Capella and about Tamara and about the impossible choice between a daughter and 3 colony systems. He told her that he did not officially exist, and that the organization that had sent him had turned on him, and that he had no leverage and no institutional backing and nothing to offer her except the fact that he was telling her things she could already verify were true. He told her that if she helped him get the proof into the right hands, hands that neither Capella nor the falsifying compact faction could reach, 3 human systems would receive their resource shipments this winter, and the compact would survive the political fallout with its moderate bloodlines intact, and the Grand Arbiter would learn that his daughter had been the one to save it. Then he stopped composing and looked at what he'd written. He added one more line. He told her, "I know you've been working on this longer than I have and losing more than I have, and I know you have no reason to trust a human who crawled through a Vethkai party and stole data from a lamp. But the thing I've learned about doing this kind of work is that sometimes the person you can trust is the one who also has nothing left to lose." He sent it. Then he sat back and waited. She responded in 40 minutes, which in Vethkai communication terms was approximately the equivalent of instantly. She wrote, "The human understanding of loss as a basis for trust is strange, but I have examined your message for 17 discrepancies and found 2, both explicable by information asymmetry rather than deception. I will help you. Do not make me regret this. My time is not infinite, and my patience for human imprecision is limited." Kael read it twice and then handed the screen to Tamara, who read it and laughed. A short, exhausted sound, nothing like humor, but something like relief. "She sounds like my thesis advisor," Tamara said. "Good. Your thesis advisor kept you honest. My thesis advisor almost failed me for using contractions, did she?" "No. I removed the contractions." They looked at each other, and Tamara almost smiled, and Kael almost did too, and then they got back to work. Getting into the Directorate Evidence Vault required a series of steps that Kael ran through in his head like a maintenance checklist, which was how he handled complex operations, not as a plan, but as a sequence of physical tasks, each one contingent on the previous one being complete. Each one small enough to be managed without thinking about everything that came after. Step 1. Establish a presence on Andra without triggering the detention alert. Velsayaroth handled this. She had, through means she declined to specify, and Kael declined to ask about, arranged for the Vethkai Compact to request a temporary suspension of the human detention warrant pending diplomatic review of the circumstances around 8th's death. The Directorate couldn't ignore a formal compact diplomatic request without creating an incident that would make the trade talks irrelevant by a more catastrophic route. The warrant wasn't cleared, but it was frozen, which meant Kael could move. Step 2. Access to the Vault's secondary authentication node. Tamara handled this. She still had her credentials. She would be burned after this, but she had already made her choice about what she was protecting. Step 3. The Vault itself. That one was Kael. He went in through a maintenance corridor that ran alongside the evidence storage block. The same kind of overlooked infrastructure that large organizations always built and then forgot about. Because the people who designed evidence vaults thought about locks and biometric readers, and not about the crawlways through which the heating system accessed its own regulators. He found the node in the 3rd evidence rack. It was tagged with his arrest identifier. He removed it. He replaced it with a facsimile Velsay had transmitted the schematics for, a Vethkai information vessel, identical in external configuration, empty of everything. In a vault that processed hundreds of items a month, the substitution would take weeks to surface. He was back in the corridor in 11 minutes. He gave himself exactly until the end of the corridor to feel the thing he'd been not feeling since the arrest. The particular fear that lived beneath competence. The part of him that understood he had been erased by his own organization and had been operating for 3 days in a system designed to end him. He let it be there, briefly, crouched in a maintenance corridor, smelling like recycled atmosphere. Then he kept moving. Capella was in the Directorate's forward conference suite when the Compact's formal diplomatic delivery arrived. Kael was watching on a secondary feed that Velsay had pulled through Compact diplomatic access. He watched Capella receive the sealed information vessel, watched him open it, watched him read what was inside. The decrypted falsification data, the tertiary channel records showing his coordination with the minority bloodline faction, the communication logs that put his signature on the decision to silence Ath and frame the operative they'd sent in to expose what he was protecting. Capella's bioluminescence did not flicker, of course. He had none. But his face did the human equivalent. It went very still, and then it arranged itself into something calm and professional and completely hollow. He picked up his comm unit. He said something Kael couldn't hear. Then he put down the comm unit. Velsay's annotation appeared on the feed. The information has been simultaneously delivered to the Interspecies Arbitration Tribunal, the 3 colony system administrators, and the Office of the Directorate Secretary General. Deputy Director Capella's security access was suspended 11 seconds ago. Kael read it. He read it again. He looked at Tamara. "Mara eats this winter," he said. Tamara closed her eyes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." The aftermath moved the way these things moved, slowly in public and very fast everywhere else. The Directorate's official position was that the Capella situation was an internal personnel matter, which fooled no one but allowed everyone involved to save a face or two during what would otherwise have been a completely ungraceful collapse. The falsification data was entered into the Kepler corridor trade talks as documentary evidence. The resource allocations were recalculated. The shipping lanes held. The minority bloodline faction within the compact lost 3 major deliberation seats. The Grand Arbiter, who had apparently known more about his daughter's activities than anyone had assumed, said nothing publicly. In private, he sent Velsay Orath a message in the oldest Vethkai written language, which his daughter translated for the Directorate liaison, and which came out in translation as approximately, "You are your mother's child, and your mother was always smarter than me, and I am grateful for it." Velsay showed Kael the translation without comment. He said, "That's a good message to get." She considered this. "Human familial communication is frequently more efficient when conveyed under duress," she said. "I have observed this. I do not know whether to find it admirable or merely practical. Can it be both?" She was quiet for a moment. Her bioluminescence was a steady amber, which Kael had learned, over 3 days of working alongside her through intermediary channels, meant she was thinking carefully about something she hadn't expected. "Yes," she said, "I believe it can." Kael's official status with the Directorate was not restored. The formal position was that an operative who had been arrested and escaped was a liability regardless of subsequent developments. And the institution had a procedure, and the procedure did not accommodate nuance. The unofficial position was delivered to him by a new analyst. Not Prescott, not Tamara, a third person entirely, a young man with a precise haircut, who met Kael in a transit kiosk on Andra's civilian ring, and ordered the dumplings, and ate them without apparent enjoyment, who told him that his detention warrant was being permanently suspended, that his pension was being quietly reinstated, and that if he wanted to continue working, he would need to be technically employed by a different subdivision and technically called something other than an operative, but that the work would be the same work. Kael looked at the young man with the precise haircut. "Does the work still matter?" he asked. The young man glanced at him. "The colony systems are receiving their shipments. I know. I'm asking about the next thing." "The next thing is—" The young man stopped. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said, "There's a situation in the Meridian Corridor. Another round of trade talks. Another potential falsification. Different faction, more sophisticated. We don't have anyone who can go in." Kael thought about ventilation shafts and walls that sang and razor bloom that cut your hands in the dark, and the way a data node sat in the base of a lamp that looked like nothing important. He thought about Tamara choosing her daughter over 3 systems for 11 years, and the particular dignity of owning that. He thought about Velsay Orath writing, "I have examined your message for 17 discrepancies." He thought about an old arbiter sending his daughter a message in a language older than the Directorate existed to translate. The work that mattered wasn't the nodes and the evidence and the procedure. The work was the moment before the walls came down, when something was still preventable. When a person who didn't officially exist could go into a space that wasn't designed for them and come out with a truth that the people with power had decided no one needed to know. He'd been doing this for 8 years. He was going to keep doing it. "Tell me about the Meridian Corridor," he said. The young analyst started talking, and Kael stopped thinking about the past, and outside the kiosk, viewport, the stars hung where they'd always been, patient and indifferent and full of problems that only very stubborn, very specific, very human people were going to solve. Much later, weeks later, in a deposition that was technically classified but would eventually be entered into the interspecies arbitration record, A Vethkai legal observer asked the question that Vethkai observers often asked when they tried to understand human covert operations: what made you think you could succeed? The answer that the human operative gave, and that was read into the record, and that the Vethkai legal observer reportedly spent several days contemplating, was this: I didn't think about success. I thought about the next thing that needed doing. And then I did that, and then there was another thing. You can't plan against people who are willing to do that. We don't stop because we're losing. We stop when we're done. The Vethkai observer had asked a follow-up, and when are you done? The operative had said, ask me then. The observer had written in their notes, later, in the oldest Vethkai written language, a phrase that translated as approximately, they are impossible to model, not because they are complex, because they are not finished yet. They never found a satisfactory response to that. Neither did anyone else.